Okay, so this is the Bible study. This is the last week of our Love and Marriage series, and we're in Matthew chapter 5. This is in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus is teaching, and so it's a good place to go. We've been in the Old Testament. We've Leviticus, the law, and Psalms, and we've been in the teachings of Paul in First Corinthians, and we're kind of ending the whole thing with the teachings of Jesus. So the primary text for our time here together will be in Matthew chapter 5, and that is verses 27 through 32. But we will also be cross-referencing some texts from all over the Bible. So as we go through and answer these questions, just to show that these things are affirmed and I think explained in other texts as well. So the text for today says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Okay, so number one, and remember that you can download a PDF copy of this Bible study so that you can follow along with us and read with us the questions so that we're all on the same page as we study here. Number one says, what is happening all around this text in Matthew chapter 5? I don't know. We just jumped into the middle of this, and we did. And maybe you don't know, but that's the reason we put this question here. If you don't know the answer to the question, the role of a teacher is to help teach you the answers to these questions. And so if you don't know, that's a good question to ask and for us to answer. So if you, well, let me just read the rest of the answers. B, well, I read the Beatitudes at the beginning of the chapter. And so those are at the beginning of chapter 5 there. We call those, that may be some churchy language, the Beatitudes, but they're the blesseds. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for instance. We see a whole list of those as Jesus is teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. C says this is commonly called the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus is giving a lot of valuable instruction. So the way Matthew writes this, all of this instruction was given in one teaching at a time when people gathered around Jesus and sat on a hill. And scholars have gone back and forth on that because obviously all of the descriptions of this part of the text in each of the four gospels sounds just a little bit different. So there's a version of this in at least one of the other gospels, but there's also a lot of these teachings in some of the gospels are spread around a little bit more. But when we read this chapter in Matthew, we call this the Sermon on the Mount. I think that they've given another name to the list of teachings. I think it's in Mark's gospel because of the difference in how they describe the place where he sat down to teach. But this is the Sermon on the Mount, and it's a lot of valuable instruction, whether it was all in a day or multiple days of teaching there in one place, or whether it was sort of compiled and compacted into one section in Matthew's gospel. Perhaps we don't know, but it probably doesn't matter that much, because I do think that we can affirm that these are the things that Jesus taught. D, in the immediate surroundings of this passage, Jesus is addressing several issues of the law, like thou shalt not murder, and suggesting that there is a sin of the heart that can happen before the action is taken, or even when the action is not taken. So what we just did here is we zoomed in. We talked about the Beatitudes. We talked about how this is the Sermon on the Mount, and then we kind of came in to this one little section of scripture here, where the immediate surrounding verses are specifically geared towards Jesus addressing the law and issues of the law, and then talking about the thing that happens in the heart before somebody even breaks the law, or perhaps even when a person follows the law, doesn't even break the law, but in their heart, they've gone into a place where they've broken the spirit of the law, because Jesus cares more about the heart than he does about just our actions. And so a lot of times it's harder for us to put together a law that deals with the attitudes of the heart. We can put together a law that says, thou shalt not, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. But what is it that happens in us, in our heart, before we break the law, that may be the more important thing to address? And so what Jesus is addressing in this section, and particularly, the immediate vicinity of this section, is this issue of you can hate in your heart, and you really have murdered that person already, even if you don't go then and commit the actual murder. It's still sin, because you have wished that person dead, and the attitude of your heart is such that is the same as the person who had actually killed them. The only difference between you and them, perhaps, is that you're afraid of punishment, so you don't want to go actually do that thing, but your heart is exactly the same. And so that's important to understand, since when we get into verse 27, Jesus is addressing the issue of adultery in exactly the same way, or like a parallel way at least, of the way that he addressed the issue of murder. So number 2 says, what is the command or law that Jesus is addressing in 5:27? And we can see it also in Exodus 20:14. So he says, you have heard that it was said. We see that a lot in this section of scripture. And so he's saying, you already know the law, and this is what the law says, but I'm going to explain the law and the intent of God for you in this law. So he says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. So in Exodus 20:14, that is the law. That is the 10 commandments. Exodus 20:14 says, you shall not commit adultery. So Jesus is taking that law from Exodus 20:14, teaching the people and saying, you've heard this. Let me help you understand what God's real desire is for you with regard to that law. So then number 3 says, what does Jesus tell his listeners or his readers, because we have it still today, in 5:28? He says, but I tell you. So in other words, you heard it one way, but I'm going to clarify. I'm going to tell you something that's going to change the way you think about this law that you think you've been following. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So what Jesus says, just like the fact that somebody hates means they've essentially already murdered. They want to do that thing. And they've already sort of decided that this is how they feel, and they feel in the same way as a person would feel if they were going to murder. The only thing is there's something standing in their way, perhaps the legal code and the punishment that might be involved, or the social destruction, or the social consequences of actually committing that act. And so you're just storing up that hate in your heart instead, because you think you can avoid the social consequences but still feel that way. So he's saying the same thing with adultery, and he's saying, so if you look at somebody lustfully, in other words, if you looked at somebody and you want that person for your pleasure, and you it says you've already committed adultery with that person. You've already done that. The only thing that is keeping you from doing that perhaps is how it'll affect your family, or what your friends are going to think, or what your pastor's going to think, or because obviously it's not like murder, and you're not going to get in trouble in terms of the legal system these days for committing adultery. At one time, perhaps even when Jesus was teaching, that may have been the case, but today for us, that's not the case. So what is it that keeps us from committing adultery? Well, maybe we love God and we actually love our spouse, and so we choose not to do that. And we choose not to think of other women or other men in that way, because we love God and we love our spouse. Perhaps, I hope. I'd like to believe, and I hope, and I believe that that's the case for me. I love God. I love my wife. That's why I'm not going to do that. But is it possible that a lot of us, that's not the reason, and the only reason is because of what people would think, or how would it affect our kids, or things like that? And so we've chosen not to do that for social consequence reasons. And here's the problem: if that's the truth, then perhaps we are still tempted to, in our heart and in our mind, act on that thing without acting on it in our life physically. And so this is the problem that we have. And a lot of people have sins of lust in their heart, and they're thinking about what they would do to somebody, and what they want them to do to them, and they're sinning in their heart even without acting that out. And by the way, that's still affecting them and their relationship with their spouse, whether they believe it or whether they know it or not. It is absolutely affecting their relationship with their spouse, because the more their mind is focused on other women and not their spouse, or other men and not their spouse, the more that relationship of love that they've chosen to have with their spouse is deteriorating. And not only that, if you're acting on it in some way without acting with another person, if you're acting on it yourself in some dark room, then you're deteriorating. And we talked about this a couple weeks ago. You're deteriorating your own physical connection, the one flesh connection that you have with your spouse, and you really are hurting your relationships, whether you realize it or not. And so Jesus is teaching that you don't have to actually go out and act on this thing in order for it to be a problem in your life. Actually, there is sin that can happen without ever acting it out. When you make a decision in your heart to dwell upon, and we talked about this in our Wednesday study about desire drags, each man is tempted when by his own evil desires he's dragged away and enticed. And when that desire conceives, it gives birth to sin. And we talked about what is conception? What does that mean? There's a decision of the will to dwell on that thing and to consider and continue down this path, even if we never get to the physical action that makes that sin. It's not immediately when a thought about a beautiful woman or a handsome man or whatever pops into your head. It's what do you do with that? Because the honest truth is there are some things that we have seen that are difficult to, you can't unsee, right? And whether that's in our past or whether that's something that we see because somebody is not dressing appropriately or something like that, and you can't unsee it, and there's a temptation there. But the question is, what do you do with that? Do you stick to that? Do you dwell on that? Do you hold on to that? Or do you take the thought captive and submit it to the will of God? So the question is, what happens? Do we, when we look at somebody lustfully, it's not when we see them and we see that they're beautiful or handsome. It's what do we do next? So we saw them. Do we keep looking? Do we look again? Do we continue down that path? Do we start thinking and spiraling out that way, or do we take that thought captive and turn away from it? So now it says in number 4, why do you think that Jesus said this, given what we have already learned in our Love and Marriage series? So now we're going to try to refer back to our Love and Marriage series and the things we've been talking about. A says, because when we dwell on a thought like this and allow it to remain, we are choosing to dwell on our own pleasure, even at the expense of someone we have committed ourselves to. This is not love, this is lust. Okay, so when we choose to dwell on that, we're not putting somebody else first. Who is edified by us continuing down that path? Who is built up? First of all, nobody's built up, but who gets the pleasure out of me thinking about somebody and they don't even know I'm thinking about them? And if my wife's not around and I'm thinking about this person, who gets the pleasure out of that? That's all about me. That's not about anybody else. That is not love, that is lust. And so we've been talking about that and how that tears down relationships instead of building up relationships. And we should be acting in love, not in lust. B says, because sexual sin is committed against your own body, the damage can be done in our hearts and our minds before we commit the act. And that's from 1 Corinthians 6:18. We said that. So the damage can be done whether we literally go sleep with somebody who is not our spouse or not. And that's important because the damage can be done inside of us and in the way that we relate to other people, whether it's the people we were thinking about or not. So we watch these crime dramas on TV, and whenever there's some creepy, weird stalker person, it never starts out with them like going in and murdering people. It always started out with them fantasizing in their mind. And I'm not suggesting that that everyone who fantasizes in their mind will eventually murder somebody, but I am saying that it will change the way you think about that person that you're thinking about, and you won't be treating them in love. You will be thinking about them for your pleasure, and it will change your relationships in your life. C says, well, maybe it doesn't just have to do with this subject. When we combine this with the text before this about murder, it seems to suggest that God cares as much or more about the attitude of our hearts than he does about our actions. The attitude of our hearts is often the root of our actions, and that's absolutely true. So that's what why Jesus is talking about this. That does matter. Jesus cares about our external actions. He cares about our relationships, but he cares about our heart, because our heart leads us into the kind of actions and the kind of relationships we're going to have. And in our heart is where the root of all that is, and he wants that to be devoted to him, and not to ourselves. And so there's an idolatry problem there. Number 5 says, do you think this only applies to men? Yes or no? So one of the things that I think we talked about this when we were in the Leviticus 18 text, but one of the challenges that we have in scripture today is we are in an equal society where men and women increasingly have equal rights, and I think in idea have had equal rights for a long time, but increasingly in practice we're getting closer to that ideal. And so let me just say that we need to understand that the context into which this was written is that was not the case. It was a man-centric society. Women in general did not choose their marriage partner. That it was chosen by their family. The man was the deciding factor in almost everything in that culture. And so when Jesus begins to teach men, when Leviticus 18 says a man should not approach this woman to have sex with them, a man should not approach that woman to have sex with her, a man should not approach, notice that it's always the man deciding. Now, we know today that women can decide who to have sex with just as well as men. But we should not go and say, okay, well, Jesus's commands were only for men, though. They were not. They were addressed to men because men were the ones making the decisions. They were the primary offenders. They were the aggressors. They were the people that made those decisions, and women were often submissive and perhaps the victim of the situation. And so now, I don't believe that that's the case anymore. I believe that men and women have equal say in who has sex with who in most situations. Okay. And so now we need to apply the teachings of Jesus that seem to be addressed primarily to men at the time to both men and women in our society today. So it does not only apply to men, it applies to all people. It applies to anybody who would make the decision who they were going to marry and who they were going to sleep with and who they might think about in a sexual way. And so we need to be sure that we address this to the women just as much as to the men. Number 6 is the last question, but it has a lot of words. It takes up half the page. And so there's a lot of teaching going on even within the answers to the question. So hopefully it'll guide us in a positive direction as we handle this. So number 6 says, how are we to handle verses 31 through 32? So in 31 through 32, we transition, at least in the NIV Bible, we transition from a paragraph where the title is adultery to a paragraph where the title is divorce. And the concepts or the thoughts about adultery are now being applied to the decisions we make with regard to divorce. Let me just say this, that what we learn, and I don't think this shows up particularly in any of the answers here, but so I want to say this, what we learn is that God is not as impressed with a piece of paper. Like he's not swayed by the fact with, oh, God, no, it's okay because we're divorced. I'm no longer married, and so now it's okay. And we find out that Jesus in his teaching is saying, so if if you divorce your wife and she wasn't sexually immoral and she hadn't already committed sexual immorality, then you are making her a victim of adultery. And anyone who marries her is committing adultery. So what he's saying is that if you divorce her and now she's alone, and by the way, in that society, a woman alone had no means of support, and so then she gets remarried, then there's adultery happening, because in the eyes of God, she is still married to that man, because he didn't say, oh, hey, certificate of divorce, okay, never mind, you don't have to be committed anymore. So A says, well, I think it's safe to say that God does not like divorce, and God is not so quick to dissolve relationships and pretend they never existed, since Jesus still calls it adultery after the divorce has happened. So you hear what I'm saying in this answer is that just because we say, oh, the marriage is over, I'm no longer married, therefore it's not adultery, because I'm single, and God says, wait, because you have a piece of paper, because you just like decided that, so now all of a sudden you have become one flesh, as we talked about, as we taught, and now you think this piece of paper makes you not one flesh. So now why does the text say except for sexual immorality? Because I know this, a lot of people say, well, my husband's got a problem with lust, and right above here it says that that's sexual immorality and that's adultery, so I can divorce him now, and I have biblical grounds for divorce. This is a churchy phrase that we use. Because there was sexual immorality, I have biblical grounds for divorce, and so I'm okay doing that. And it's no longer, well, Jesus is teaching about adultery, and how lust is adultery has now helped somebody find much easier means towards biblical grounds for divorce. And then we've used God's word, which was trying to hold us to a higher standard, as an excuse to fulfill a lower standard. Think about that. Think about what we've done with this. And so what this is telling us, what we really should receive from verses 31, 32 is not, oh, if it's sexual immorality, it's okay, because it says except sexual immorality, and then it's biblical grounds for divorce. He says anyone who divorces his wife except sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, let me tell you why it says except for sexual immorality. Not because that makes it okay to divorce, but because in that case, the man divorcing his wife did not make her the victim of adultery. She committed adultery herself. You see it? So we're confused, and we use that except for sexual immorality as a license to, okay, now I can get a divorce. It's saying, no, God doesn't want this relationship dissolved at all. And one of the things that's happening is, if we're dissolving it for whatever reason, just for any and every reason, because that's what they asked. We're going to go to that text here in a minute. They said, is it okay for us to just do this for any reason? The command in Deuteronomy is like a little confusing. There's been a disgrace. I don't know what that means. It's kind of like high crimes and misdemeanors when we're impeaching the president now. We don't even know what that means. And if he says something funny, we can now impeach the president. That's always the way it is now. So I don't know what a disgrace is, but They said, can we divorce people for any and every reason? And God says, Jesus says, no, look, if you're divorcing and there was no sexual immorality, then you're leading to adultery, and adultery is one of the big ones. Adultery is one of the thou shalt nots, okay? And so let me help you understand. That's not what. And when they said, oh, he said, except for in sexual immorality. No, that doesn't mean that it's okay and you're not committing any sin. Then I'm telling you that in that case, the sin was already committed when sexual immorality happened. And so now you can go ahead and divorce if you want, but compounding sin upon sin. And we'll get to that here in a minute because we're going to reference a few other texts. Okay, B, well, Deuteronomy 24 and Mark 10 seem to suggest there was already some confusion about what was allowed even at the time of Christ. The law allowed for divorce, and the Pharisees were trying to figure out where to draw the line or test Jesus to see if he knew. So it's hard to determine for sure whether they really didn't know where the line was or whether they were just trying to test Jesus and see what he said, which they did quite often. Now in Deuteronomy 24, it says, if a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him, right here, this is the confusing terminology, because he finds something indecent about her, which we have to assume meant sexual immorality, and he writes her a certificate of divorce. See, it seems understood that that's allowed, and he gives it to her and sends her from his house. And if after she leaves his house, she becomes the wife of another man, and her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her and sends her from his house, or if he dies, then her first husband who has divorced her is not allowed to marry her again. She has been defiled and would be detestable in the eyes of the Lord. Do not bring sin upon the land. So it's confusing because there was definitely a certificate of divorce allowed. And he says, so then she goes and marries somebody else and he sends her away. And now you can't go marry the first guy because you're becoming one flesh. And then you rip that flesh apart, became one flesh with another person, then you rip that flesh apart, and now you're going to come back together. No, this is no good. What we're doing here is a mess, and it's not. So the point of all of this is, see, sometimes we think, oh, if I go back with the first person, then it's okay. It doesn't count. It's sort of like it's better than going with the third person. And that's kind of our logic. And he's saying, none of this is good. None of this should be happening. In Mark chapter 10, Jesus addresses this. It says, Jesus then left that place, went to the region of Judea, across from the Jordan. Again, people came to him, as was his custom. He taught them. Some Pharisees came and tested him by asking, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? What did Moses command you? He replied. They replied, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. Now that was true. And notice the difference between permitted and commanded. There's another text where that seems a little more obvious even than this. And then Jesus says, it was because your hearts were hard that Moses wrote you this law. So in other words, Jesus is saying that Moses allowed something that was not God's perfect will. It was an allowance because the hard command made it confusing to know what to do if something happened that was not the will of God to begin with. And that's the challenge, right? These hard commands get us into positions where we say, well, what do we do now? And because something that wasn't supposed to happen has now happened. And so Moses allowed for something that was not the perfect will of God. But Jesus continues in verse 6, but at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united with his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. So we looked at this in Genesis. We looked at this in the words of Paul. Now we see this quoted by Jesus, and he clarifies, so they are no longer two, but they are one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. And so then in verse 10 and 11, he says, and 12, he says pretty much the same thing as what he said in the Matthew text. But all of this is to clarify that verse 5, I think, is the most important, that Moses permitted something in the law that was not the full will of God. And Jesus tells us that Moses permitted it because their hearts were so hard that they would not receive the actual desire and heart of God. And so I've counseled with people where adultery has happened in their relationship, and I've talked to them. Some of them have made it through. Some of them have struggled. Some of them have not made it through at all. And one of the things that I've said is that our hearts are hard, so we choose not to forgive, and we choose not to love, and we choose not to continue on once we've been injured. And so that's a real problem. And so divorce was allowed, it still was not the will of God. And so I think we need to understand this, that in all of this text is that the question is, are we concerned about following the law and the outward? Are we concerned about doing the will of God and following his heart? And we can get really legalistic about divorce and remarriage, and we can kind of turn the screws down and squeeze down on people who this has happened in their life. But I think we're missing the point that none of this was really God's will in the first place. So now C says, well, while we're trying to figure out where to draw the line, like the Pharisees before us in Mark, Jesus points out the issue of the heart that gets to the point of the needing to ask the question. This actually fits with the text surrounding Matthew 5. Jesus points out in Mark 10 why we would try to come up with a situation where divorce is okay, that our hearts are hard. So then it appears we could even follow the law of Moses and what he permitted and still have a heart that is far from the desire that God has for our life. How badly do you need to find out where to draw the line? So that's my experience when we're teaching a text like this, is we got to figure out where to draw the line. So wait, it's not okay to divorce, but what if this? But what if that? Well, what if there was sexual immorality? Then Moses allows for it, and Jesus says, stop trying to find when it's okay. I don't like any of it. And if we're going to drill down on the law and get legalistic, well, that's one thing. And I get that the problem is that once we get ourselves in this situation, we have these problems. So once somebody is divorced, then they go to 1 Corinthians where Paul says, 1 Corinthians 7:2, we're going to talk about that in answer D, where Paul says, you probably shouldn't, if there's sexual immorality, you shouldn't stay single. And we're like, how do we deal with that? Now we got people that are divorced and they're struggling and wrestling with sexual immorality, and we're telling them they can't get remarried. And what do we do with that? And Jesus is sitting here saying, the problem all started long before this. I didn't want broken relationship at all. God the Father does not want this relate. Now, once the relationship's broken, we're trying to decide what to do. And then we can get legalistic and decide. And I honestly, this is something I've wrestled with my whole ministry, and I still don't know the answer. I still don't know. Is it okay for people to get remarried after they've gone through a divorce. Maybe the divorce was not their plan. It was not their hope. It was not their fault. You know, I don't know. If I had my desire, my heart, I'd find a way to go back before that divorce ever happened, and find a way to stop it, and find a way to have the people's hearts soften and choose love. But in many cases, the honest truth is those people should have never been married to begin with, because when they got married, they didn't get married because of love, because they didn't even understand love in our cultural context, and they weren't entering into a relationship of selfless love to begin with. So here we began this series talking about love in 1 Corinthians 13, and how all of this has to be built on it, and we're ending it in the same place. And the challenge is that if we're starting our relationships from the wrong place, it's a far higher percentage chance that it's going to end in the wrong way, and we're going to find ourselves sitting here once again trying to figure out where we go from here, and what is okay from here. And I think that I think that if anything, this is where I would go. This is um, let me read D so that we can kind of end with this. Well, many times we look at these verses, people have already been divorced and trying to figure out what that means about their future, i.e., whether they should get married again. At this point, they are often trying to balance this text with the instructions of Paul we studied in 1 Corinthians 7:2. This Matthew text seems to be trying to stop divorce to begin with, and pointing out that the damage was done at that point. And so one of the things that I think is really clear in this Matthew text is he's telling them not to divorce, because it's at the time of divorce that they create a situation where adultery is just about bound to happen with remarriage. Okay, that's the way I read this text, where he's saying, when you divorced, you created the problem, and then what's going to happen is it almost sounds like that seems inevitable, the next step. And so the problem was created at the divorce. So now I'm convinced that if we could go back to the beginning and only start relationships on the basis of love, we would be in a better place. We can't go back to the beginning. We can't restart. People are already married. Some people are already divorced, and we can't go back. And so here's where my counsel is for the people of God. Too many who have been damaged by past relationships are lonely and are rushing into all sorts of other relationships, and they create the problem all over again. And we have people that didn't understand love when they got married the first time, that are so lonely and so sexually tempted that they're rushing into another relationship without understanding love the second time either. And too often there's a third time, because of the fact that we are rushing from person to person, from relation to relationship, without stopping and learning what it means to love another person, love God and love others. And so I think the thing that is so important to me, rather than deciding to be legalistic about whether we're going to allow for remarriage and all of these things, the most important thing to me is to stop and think, what has changed in me? How am I different? And how do I need to be different in order to make sure that I don't restart the cycle and create the problem all over again? And so whatever has been made new at this point, whatever of the past has washed away. And I believe, and perhaps you're one of those who believes, that 1 Corinthians 7:2 is a significant text for you, and and you really need to take away that situation where you're too likely to rush into sexual immorality. And you say, I think I need to be remarried, and I know what this Matthew text, and I don't know what to do about it all. And if that's you, let me just say this, that I think at very least you need to pause and take a breath, because at very least you need to be a different person. And if you're not pausing and taking a breath, if you're chasing after somebody because of the burning in your loins, if you're chasing after somebody because of the loneliness in your heart, then let me just tell you, you're chasing after somebody for selfish reasons already. And so you need to stop, and you need to restart your thinking, and make sure that whatever you do next is not going to create another problem between you and somebody, or between you and God, and that whatever you're doing from here on out is loving. It is birthed in love. And I am not by any means a legalistic person. I wrestle over some of these scriptures. I do think we ought to follow the scripture, and we ought to follow the commands of Jesus. I really do. And so I've been wrestling with this my whole ministry, but especially in preparation for this study. And I'm going to back away from speaking a hard yes or no that is blanket for everybody. I would say that I lean towards no, don't be remarried if that's possible for you. And I lean towards that because of the words of Jesus and what he says here. But I also understand the impact of 1 Corinthians 7:2, and I understand that we're not living in a world of perfect circumstances, and here we are, having already lived the life that we've lived, with the past already as it is, and I think we need to make decisions that are best between us and God for our future. And so that means that we need to know what that is, and that means that we probably shouldn't be rushing into anything. And in our church, in our ministry, with so many of our broken pasts, this is a question that I wrestle with, and we discuss over and over and over again, and people want to know. And I refuse, first of all, to provide license to somebody. We did study that scripture that says, whatsoever is not of faith is of sin. And if you're not sure it's okay, you shouldn't be doing it to begin with. And so that's a good start. So I refuse to give license to somebody to do something that may not be the will of God. But I also refuse to condemn those who have made that decision feeling as if it was the will of God. And but anybody who's still wrestling with that decision, I would urge you above all to make sure that whatever you do, that you're starting out with an understanding of love, so that you don't put yourself into a position of making the same mistake twice or more than twice, which too often has been the case. These are tough things, and however you feel about the scripture, I love you, and I'm excited to wrestle over it with you.